This small set of steps or mini stepladder is a simple project that you can make with relatively basic equipment. It's practical and gives you the chance to experiment with materials and fixing methods without any traditional joinery or chisel work. If you're looking for something to explore with students in a design or shop class, then this concept might be worth a try. Hi, I'm Colin. I was inspired to develop this idea after making the video on this more traditional stepladder. These steps use manufactured boards, which are easy to come by, and you can get away with just a drill, jigsaw, and a router for this job, which is great if you want to give students an experience with powered tools without having to use the big scary ones. I'll keep this process fairly high level again, but this should give you a good enough idea of how to go about designing and making something like this. The first part is to make a pattern. I spent a bit of time working through the proportions in Shaper 3D before starting to sketch this out on actual material. Now, you don't need to use 3D modelling software for this, of course, but if you have access to it, the process can be a really useful exercise, especially for students. Using my jigsaw circle cutting guide as a giant compass, I marked out the design on this recycled piece of MDF. I then marked out the rest, working off my CAD model in addition to a few adjustments that I made on the fly. Then, the next question was, how to cut this out? How was I going to address the internal cuts? I think I'll start with this curve here, and then I'll follow it up with this curve going to about here. Then I'll restart it here and go to just past that point. Then I'll have to rough cut the rest of this out with my jigsaw and then use some straight edges and a flush trim bit to get those nice straight edges internally. I can use the track saw here to get those outside ones done, so that's not too difficult. And I will also end up with some rounded corners here, but that's okay because that's actually part of the intended design. So let's see how we go with that. Sounds like a plan. Using my jigsaw, I cut out the big curves first. You need to work out some kind of a circle cutting jig if you don't have one like this. And I have to say this Festool one is awesome and well worth it. I'm just rough cutting here because I'll be finishing off all the edges with a flush trim router bit. This is what will form the pattern, which I can then use to trace onto the nicer material and bear up against when flush trimming the actual workpiece. The straight edges I can cut using the track saw. These are the easy cuts. And there's the pattern emerging. Now to trim the edges. I'm using some 9mm ply with straight edges to align along the pattern. This will allow me to make a straight pass with the router. To keep it all firmly in place, I'm using screws to fix the edge to the MDF. It's easier and more accurate than clamping. Then using the flush trim bit and the router, I can clean off the edges. Make sure you've got good extraction on your router for this process. This Ryobi router is actually quite good, even if the dust port fitting is a bit cheap and brittle. Well, there's the first template. Why the first? And why do I need another one? That's a good question. Probably because the second one will show the rounded corners inside on these inside corners here, and especially this one here as well. And I just think that looks more complete. I think it'll be a nicer template to work with. It also means that when you trace it onto a piece of material, you'll actually get the real shape. Now, I don't really have to do this, but I want to. Since the first template is just about right, I can use it to easily trace out and then recut another piece of MDF for the second template. I don't need a circle cutting guide for this cut because I'll be flush trimming it from the first template. And with the first template screwed onto the second one, I'm ready to do more routing. This routing task is fairly quick and easy to do. There's not much to take off and the MDF is only 9mm thick. I'm using 15mm birch ply for this project because I happen to have some spare from another job and the piece was just large enough. I'm being careful to screw the template to the job so that the screw holes will be covered up by the steps. And now more rough cutting with the jigsaw. I'm trying to get as close as I can to the line to minimise how much the router needs to remove, and I probably should have used my chip guard for this process. Oh well, next time. Then place the template back onto the workpiece, ready for routing. To ensure I get as clean a cut as possible, I'm also giving some attention to the router bit. Keeping the cutting edge clean should minimise any fraying on the cut. And now it's just a matter of routing all the excess away using the flush trim bit. I've been left with a bit of a furry edge, but some very light sanding will take care of that. And of course, I had to make two of these, one for each side. Now, to locate the holes for where the steps will be fitted, I've developed a 3D printed drilling jig especially for this job. This will ensure I get the holes spaced exactly where I want them to be. Do you need to use a 3D printed jig for this? Well, of course not. Some very careful marking out will do the job. But this jig gives me the opportunity to design small cylinders where the holes are, which create nice drilling guides for making vertical holes through the workpiece without the need for a drill press. Aligning them carefully, I can then drill the holes. I'm using some sacrificial melamine under the workpiece to ensure I get nice, cleanly drilled holes, and that's looking pretty good. I can then use one workpiece as a guide to drill straight through into the other workpiece. And there are the two sides to this job. Looking good so far. I used a similar process for drilling the holes in the steps using a 3D printed drilling guide designed especially for this project. Now you could have also used a dowel jig or something similar, but I thought a custom jig would be more fun. Then I can install the 15mm screw inserts, which will then take the M6 screws to hold the whole project together. I've designed a 50mm wide brace for the underside of the step to provide lateral stability and to stop the step from bending too much when weight is applied. Using an offcut as a spacer, I can then align the brace to the step and simply glue it into place. Then apply a weight and allow to dry. For a finish, I'm using linseed oil. I wanted something quick and easy to apply, and I just happened to have this in the workshop, so I thought I'd give it a try. I'm using a 50-50 mix of oil and mineral turpentine, and if you're doing this with a class and you're worried about using terps, then you can also use the oil undiluted. Simply paint it on nice and evenly with a brush, and then wipe off the excess so that the surface doesn't dry too tacky. And of course, do this in a well-ventilated space, and use gloves. The oil on its own isn't too bad, but the terps makes the odour quite strong. After the 2 coats of oil have dried, I'm using a natural hard wax for that bit of extra finish. It's relatively safe to use, it doesn't spill out of a jar and seems to go a long way for such a small container. And it smells nice. The finish is really starting to look good, at least I think so. To assemble the job, I'm using M6 stainless steel countersunk socket screws. These have quite a nice appearance and give the job kind of an industrial or utilitarian look. I've always liked the appearance of exposed fasteners, especially when the ones you choose look a bit special to begin with. Just be mindful to assemble the job evenly to avoid any misalignment or twisting. Since I'll be using this on a timber floor eventually, I'm also applying some felt pads to the base of each leg. And there it is, the finished product. Now for some strength testing. Bear in mind here that I weigh 85 kilos and take a size 14 shoe. The deflection in the step treads is fairly minor given my weight and shoe size. I'm quite pleased with that. The lateral stability also looks pretty good. Again, bear in mind that I'm 6'4", and it would most likely be shorter or smaller people using this product. For slightly less deflection in the treads, I could have perhaps increased the thickness to 18mm ply, something to consider for the design students in your class. But overall, it looks and feels quite stable. I really like it. So if you're looking for a hobby project or a project to make with a design class that's a bit more contemporary, then this might interest you, especially since you can make some adjustments to the design parameters, things like the material chosen, thickness, fasteners, stuff like that. I quite like the way the internal triangle shape has turned out, and I think the radius curves have just the right amount of curvature. If I was going to make another one, the first thing I'd experiment with is the material thickness, or perhaps just a different type of 15mm ply, just to see if I could take a bit more of the flex out of it. And perhaps I'd also experiment with a completely different finish. I think this would look good painted in a bold, glossy colour. I hope you got value out of watching that process. I certainly enjoyed making it. And thanks for watching all the way to the end, because there was actually a fair bit to go through in this project. If you've got some ideas about changes that you'd make based on this concept, then I'd love to hear about them down in the comments. That's it for this project. Once again, thanks for watching. I'm Colin, and we'll see you in the next video.